So main topic for this class was objects, and I think we covered deeply enough that you understand what objects, interactions, inheritance, all those things mean. Lecture for today's lecture will be just object interaction, and you guys will be telling me how to do that. So I'll give you a problem, and we'll do coding together. So let's get started. Let me actually share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. So you guys able to see my Word document? All right, so this is what we're going to be working on. If you don't have IntelliJ open, go and open it. So we're going to be doing a lot of coding, and we're going to try to figure out how to create this reservation system. So airline reservation system. So that's what we're going to be creating. So I'm going to open up my IntelliJ, and I'll go reshare my screen. So while that's opening, how many classes do we need? 3 classes. 3 classes are passenger, flight, and reservation, right? So 3 classes. And how many fields in each of those classes? So what about passenger? How many fields do we need? So how many fields for passenger? 3. Okay. I thought it was just 3 before that. Okay. Right. And how many fields for flight? How many attributes for flight? How many attributes do we have for flight? 4. All right. And the reservation, how many attributes or fields? How many do we need? So how many fields for reservation? 3. So we need reservation ID, flight, and passenger who made. So let's go ahead and get started. IntelliJ is open. You're able to see IntelliJ. So today's topic is object interaction. All right. So the first class we need is, so first one we need is a passenger. So we need passenger, we need flight, we need reservation. And the flight looks like that would be the most basic one, right? So flight would be the most basic one because it has flight number, origin, destination, and list of reservations. So flight is the one that is not actually interacting with any other class. So if you look at passenger, passenger is interacting with the reservation because passenger has a list of reservations. And if you look at the reservation class, it has a flight. So we need an object reference of flight, and the reservation also need a passenger reference of the passenger class. But if you look at flight, well, I guess you do, it is interacting. So we can do passenger or flight first. I thought flight actually don't need, it doesn't have an interaction, but it does. All right, so let's go ahead and create a passenger class. Passenger, and the fields we need are name, passport number, list of reservations. What are the data types? Name, passport number, and reservation. So what are the data types for the string, int? So string for the name, and then we have string or int for passport number. So with the passport number, if we're not going to be doing any math on the passport number, right? It's just a placeholder for just a number. So we can use either string for that as well, because if you use int and the passport number is bigger than what the primitive integer can hold for Java, then it'll give you errors. So there's a limit to how big of a number integer can hold, right? So if you have a passport number equals to a huge big number like this, then it's already giving you some problems, right? So this number is way too big. The integer cannot hold this number. And since we're not going to be doing any math on it, why not just go and change this to string? Even though they're numbers, but they are, you can use int, that is okay. But if you use int, it may give you problem if you get a passport number that is weak. Because in Java, each primitive data type, which is double, integer, long, they have a set size of memory space reserved in Java. If that memory space, if the number you're trying to type in is bigger than the memory that they reserved, then it will give you an error. It won't be able to process anything. All right, so now the last thing is the reservations. Remember, reservations is one of the classes we need to create. And we need to make a list of reservation for passengers. So we need to use this object for the list of reservations. How can we do this? So so when we create a list, for everybody, you should be thinking about array list, all those are lists, right? You create array list or arrays of string type, integer type, double type. So when you create object, that is one of the types, right? So when you can create a list off of this object type, array of type reservation. Yep. So in this case, I'm actually going to create an array list. So we can use the built-in functions, add, remove, and that kind of thing. And then if you use array list, then we don't have to keep changing the length of the list. So does that make sense? Have you guys covered array list in 218? So do reservation. All right, so forget everything I said about array list. It is one of the cool topics. Hopefully we'll get to cover it in this class. So reservation array, and we'll call that reservation. So the reason it's giving me red error because reservation type or object does not exist in my, we need to create that. Once we create it, then we'll be able to have that. So let's actually go and create reservations. So right click on source, do a new class. As soon as I create that, and then the red part goes away and we have an array of reservation. What else do we need for reservation? I'm sorry, for passenger. Going back to the question, we did this so far, but it also has some other methods that we need to implement. Implement methods for making and canceling reservations. Ensuring that when a reservation is made, the passengers and flights list of reservations are updated. And when a reservation is canceled, it is removed from all. What does that even mean? So passenger, what is one thing we need for passenger before we add any of the functions? We have the fields, constructor, right? So we need a constructor to be able to construct this. Constructor will be just passenger. Parameters would be the name. So do we need a constructor with reservations? So when we create a passenger, does it have to have a reservation? No, right? So when we create a passenger, he doesn't have to have a reservation, right? So we can just leave that as it is. And once the reservation is created for this passenger, we can update the reservations at that point. Since we're not using array list, in this case, we actually need to define how many reservations we'll have to limit the passenger with the reservations. How many can we do? Can that person do? So we actually need to declare the size for the reservation. So for right now, let's stick with what? All right, so new arrays. Does anybody remember the syntax for creating array? New, it is okay. That new reservation. And I'm really bad at syntax. So I work 6 months. I'll be working with Python. Then we switch to a different project. And working with Java, I forget everything. So yeah, I try not to memorize any of it because when I'm working with other languages, then all that if I memorize something, I'll come back and that is okay because I've seen senior the people who've been working for like 25 years, they're always looking things up. And there's no shame in looking things up because everybody at work, because there's so many different languages, you just don't have anything memorized. All right, so now there's constructor. We have this dot name equals to name, and we have this dot passport number equals to passport number, and that's all you need for the constructor. That is actually true. I mean, I cannot emphasize this enough. Don't. So even when I take like internship interviews, I'm not looking for syntax. I'm looking for their logic. So I give them a question to do on the whiteboard, and I'm looking for how are they going to solve it. I don't even tell them the language. They get to pick the language, and the person who's being interviewed get to pick the language, and they, even if they write pseudocode. Does anybody know what pseudocode is? Or has anybody done pseudocode? Yeah, pseudocode is just writing writing out the logic before you actually write the code. So writing out the logic in maybe in plain English, or something that actually makes sense to you instead of writing it in Java or C# or any other language. And that would be considered pseudocode. Pseudocode doesn't have to be perfect. It does just the logic makes sense. So even if in the interview they write pseudocode, they pass the interview because the logic makes sense. All right, that's enough for the interview part. All right, so now we have the constructor. We have 3 fields, and what else do we need for this passenger? Passenger should be able to make reservation or cancel reservation, right? So we need 2 functions. So public void make reservation, and we'll worry about the parameters in a minute, and they should be able to cancel the reservation. So public void cancel. So when they're making the reservation, what's one thing do they need? to make the reservation. The name, well, they already have a name, right? So they are the passengers. So they are the one who creating the reservation. Time, yeah. So they need time or if they have the flight information, right? So remember, we're going to be creating an object called flight that has all of this information in it. So if they just pass in the flight object, we'll be able to find the reservation and cancel it, right? So that'll be flight. So the reason it's red because I don't have an object flight. So let's go and create an object flight. And when they're canceling the reservation, they could cancel it with the flight. Would they be able to cancel it with the flight? They could cancel it with the flight, or if they have the reservation. I'm sorry, Amber. Yeah. So the reservation number or name, right? So if they have the reservation itself, they'll be able to cancel that reservation, right? So in order to make a reservation, they need flight information, but to cancel it, they need the reservation itself, right? So this kind of makes sense. So now let's get into the flight. So going back to main, flight should have attributes. I'm going to copy this line. Flight should have attributes like flight number, origin, destination, and list of reservations. So 4 of them. And what is the data type for the first string int? Yeah, the flight number, the number itself is just, I think, 230 or 2350, something like that. But there's usually like AS or AA associated with the flight number, and that's the airline code, right? So if you want to do string would be okay, because there's actually AA or airline code associated. So that would be first thing is the flight number. And the next one is the origin. And what is the origin? Where are you leaving from? So origin would be like Seattle or LA. You're leaving from LA and going to, and that would be the destination. Destination would be where you're going to, from and to. And the last thing we need is a list of reservation, and that would be something like this. So I'm going to just copy this list of reservations. So now we need a constructor for this one. Would it be public, private, protected, flight? So it's going to be actually Brenda already wrote it, so I'm going to copy that. Flight string, flight number, origin, and destination. And they actually don't pass a reservation. Reservation is something we just update inside the class. And all we do inside the constructor is initialize the field. So we do this dot flight number equals to flight number. This dot origin equals to this dot destination equals to destination. Questions, concerns? Do we need any functions? So it says implement methods like make and canceling reservation. We have those functions in passenger. We haven't actually implemented those. Ensuring that when the reservation is made, passengers in the flight list are updated, and when reservation is canceled, it is removed from all of the lists. Okay, we'll get to that part in a minute, but do we need any functions inside the flight? So it only says to make write functions, make reservation and cancel reservation. And who is able to make and cancel reservation is the passenger. So those two functions here would make sense, even though the description itself is not actually telling you where to implement those, right? These two would be the helper class, and the passenger is the one who's doing everything. The flight list of reservations would be this right here, right? So this would be the list of reservations. So it's a list. We'll be updating this list when the reservation comes in. So remember, for right now, flight and reservation are the helper classes for the passenger class. So now, if you need to add methods here, we'll come back to it. Let's move on to reservation for right now. And reservation, we need reservation should include a reservation ID, the flight it pertains to, and the passenger who made the reservation. So what would be the data type for ID? Reservation ID. String, we can do string. Let's do string. I'll call that ID. And what two other things do we need? To create a reservation, we need ID, the passenger itself, and flight number, or the flight object itself, right? So flight number exists inside the flight, right there. So we can create the flight object itself. So flight, and the flight as the reservation pertains to. Yep. So that would be the flight. And the last thing we need is the passenger. What about the constructor? What happens in the constructor? How do we construct the reservation? We need a constructor. And constructor would be for reservation. And what parameters and how would we write constructor for reservation? What things do we need to create a reservation? All right, so I have string ID, flight. Yep, so yeah, any of those would work. I'll copy Maximo. Remember, Maximo, you actually don't need the return type for constructor, right? So I'm going to get rid of this, the void, and everything else would be okay. And inside it, all we do is string this dot ID equals to ID, and this dot flight equals to flight, and this dot passenger equals to passenger. Do we need anything else? So we got reservation down, we got the flight, and we got the passenger. Now we just need to implement these two methods. What happens in the make reservation method? Or what should happen in the make reservation? Adds a reservation to the array. And how would we add that reservation to the array? Do we need to create the reservation itself first? For loop? Yeah, we can add a for loop. And so make reservation, we need an object reservation first, right? So we need something like this first, and then be able to add this object to the array. How do we do that? How do you create an object of reservation? Call the constructor, so that would be reservation equals to new reservation, like this. And what do we need to add here? ID, passenger, and flight. ID, passenger, and flight. Do we have ID here when we create the reservation? We don't have ID, but do we have passenger here? We have flight here, right? So the function actually calls for flight. So we can pass that, but we still need two things before that. So we don't have passenger, well, we don't have ID. We do have passenger. Where's the passenger in this class? So if you could look at this right here, the way we set this up, we have ID, flight, and passenger. We got the flight that's coming in, and name. So what we can do is we can use this keyword, right? So this means the passenger we are working with right now. We can just pass that in, and that would be the passenger itself. So whatever instance you're calling this method from, that is the passenger we're going to create the reservation off of. So remember, we need to pass in this object. We can't pass in the name, password, number, or anything like that. It is the object that it takes, object itself. And the object itself, the passenger, is this object. And we don't have the ID. So one thing we can do, we can take out the ID here. So ID, we can make it auto increment. So when you create a reservation, you don't get to pick the reservation ID, right? It generates the ID and give it to you. So we can take that out and we can actually generate an ID and give it to you. How can we do that? How can you generate an ID and assign it? Random number, you can do random number. Even if you do random number, right? There is no guarantee that whatever the number you generated will be generated again. So even if you have like 1,000 numbers and you get 1,000 reservations, that number, there's always a chance that number will be generated again. So what we can do is we can have a counter. So we can create a counter and update that counter as soon as we get the reservation. So increment that counter as soon as we get the reservation. So we can have a static variable here. So we can have a static int, and in that case, we're going to have to change this. We have integer ID, and we have a static. Yeah. So Brendan, I think you have the same. The same idea. Yeah. So I have a static field, class field, which is just a static field. I have a counter, and start. We're going to set that counter to 0 because we don't have any reservations. And remember, this is a static counter. So it doesn't matter how many instances you create a reservation, this counter is static. Will start at 0, and doesn't matter how many instances you create, this will increment accordingly. I'll keep track of how many have been created so far. And what we can do is right here, instead of asking the user to give us the ID, we can generate it. What we can do is we can do M counter. So right now, if we create the first reservation, what's the ID for it? If we put it this way, the first reservation ID would be 0. What it's going to do is it's going to assign it to ID and then increment. But if you do it this way, it's going to increment first and then it's going to increment first and then assign it to ID. So where you put the plus signs matter. If you put it before it, it's going to increment first and then assign it to ID. If you just set it to 1, so yeah, we could have done that. We could have started at 0. I'm sorry, at 1, and then move the plus signs the other way. Yeah, that could have been it. Since I already declared it at 0, then yeah, but that Blake the other way would have worked. All right, going back to reservation. And we're still getting an error. So we get an error with this. Why are we getting an error in this? We're creating a reservation. Oh, it's flight and then passenger. Sorry, flight and then the passenger. All right. What else do we need to do in this reservation now? Or make reservation. So we have the reservation. We created it with the flight and the passenger. How do we add it to? Set it to the index that it equals the ID. So how do we write it? So we're doing reservations and using that index from the ID. How do you get the ID reservations and how do you get the index of the ID of this reservation? So we can do reservation.id, right? That field exists. You can ask reservation from the local scope. So reservation right here, this is an object right here. And we do reservation.id that goes into reservation and gets this ID right here. They're public. They were not public. We just do get ID for save some time. I don't have any getters or anything like that. I just made it equals to. Does that make sense? Would this work? Maybe students might be getting confused with this reservation and this reservations right here. So this reservation is an instance. So I'm going to call that new reservation. And I'm going to use the new reservation name here. So nobody gets confused. Won't that create gaps in the array and eventually your index will fall over 10? How would it create gaps? Because every time you make a reservation, right, that's when the new ID is generated. And when are we creating a reservation? We're creating a reservation inside of this function. So ID only increments when we create an instance of an object, or so instance of this reservation object. So this ID increments right here. We may get into trouble. Yeah, we may get into some other problem, but for right now, so on the 11th reservation, yes, that yeah, 11th reservation will be 11. But right now we're assuming since we were not able to use array list as a storage container, so we're using arrays, and here we're restricting the whole system that we're creating to be only 10. Yeah, or we can go ahead and change that to 100, and you'll have 100. You can create up to limitation. Yeah, it'll come into play. But right now we're only saying only created up until that. So the limitation right here with 10, yeah, that will come into play when we have a lot of reservation. But right now we're just assuming we only have 10. One other thing that would be more complicated we could do, or someone is waiting in there. One other thing we could do would be create a new array every time we create a new reservation and change the size that way. But that is a little complicated. I can put out the solution for that if you want, but that would get really complicated really fast. You keep increasing the size of your array. All right, so going back to the question, we have making and canceling reservation. We have those two methods, and we have to ensure that when a reservation is made, the passengers and flight list of reservations are updated. So there is a list right here. We just updated that. We made a reservation. We added to this. They're saying this reservation needs to be updated as well. We're keeping track of two lists, right? So both of those two will need to be. How can we access this? So we just updated this list. They're asking you need to update this list also. Is there a way to access that list of this flight, instance of this flight? Everybody's typing flight.reservation. So we remember we have access to the flight. The flight is coming in as a parameter right here. We can use that instance dot and get to the reservations. We can do flight.reservations, and this is an array. And just like above, we're going to be using their ID. to add it to this right here. Equals to new reservation. Would that work? Hopefully it'll work. We'll test it out in a minute. So now we have the make reservation, and the make reservation, all it needed to do is ensure that when a reservation is made, passenger and flight list of reservations are updated. We did both of those. We updated the passenger one and we updated the flight one. Right, so what happens here when we cancel it? What happens when we cancel the reservation? We remove it from the array. So reservation is removed from the array. So similar to this, how do we remove something from the array? So we have these two, right? So here we're adding it. Here we're going to use the same exact code and remove it. But instead of new reservation, what would this be replaced? Null, or is that impossible? So remember, this new reservation, we created this instance right now, right? That's what we've been using the ID and the new reservation for. But the reservation is actually coming in here. The user is giving us the reservation. We can use that reservation to get the ID and get the ID. How do we get the flight information from here? Yes, yeah, we can do null and that would work. So now we set this reservation, the passenger reservation list, to null. That means we deleted that reservation. Now, how can we update flight list that exists here? How can we update it here? We don't remember before we were getting flight information here, but now we don't have that. Is there a way to access it? And all we'll need to do is we need to do a null on it. We set it to null. That means it's deleted. Flight reservation ID equals null. Yep, that we did that. But we don't have access to flight. So before we had access to flight, because that was one of the parameters. Now the parameter is reservation. Reservation.flight. So we have reservation and we have an instance of that reservation coming in. We use that to get the flight information. So we have reservation.flight.reservations list. I should call this reservations list. And then we get the ID of the reservation and we set it to equal to. I think we got everything, right? So we have the flight object, we have the reservation object, we have the counter that increments, and if we made a mistake, we'll come back and fix it. But we have the passenger. The passenger is able to make the reservation and cancel the reservation. And when they make the reservation, we update their reservation list and the flight. So let's test it out. How can we test that out? What's one thing we need to test it out? A passenger, yep. So we need a passenger to create a reservation. We're going to create a passenger. I'll do who suggested Zach. Zach is the passenger, and new passenger. What does the passenger take? We need a name and a passport number. So we need a name, which is that, and the passport number, that is a string, and we do passport number for flight. To make a reservation, what do we need? A flight. To make a reservation, call this function, we need a flight. To call the flight, we need, let's do Seattle to LA equals to new flight. And it needs a flight number, string. Flight number is, that's to Alaska Airlines 230. And then we need origin. Origin would be string, Seattle, and destination is LA. And now we can make the reservation. So we can make the reservation, Zach.make reservation, and we pass in the flight that is called Seattle to LA. When we make the reservation right here, we're not actually returning anything, right? So when they make the reservation, what should happen? So when you make the reservation online, what do you get in return? Return the ID, right? So we should be returning an ID here when we make the reservation. So here, instead of void, I'm going to do int, and at the end, I'm going to do return new reservation ID. So ID is returned, and we can cache that as reservation, or we can return the ID, or we can actually return the reservation itself and get the ID. So that would be up to you, however you want to do it. You can return the ID or you can return the reservation itself. I'm actually going to return the reservation. And if you need the ID, you can get the ID from the reservation object. All right, so now we can print that reservation out. We don't have a string, a two-string method, and I'm not going to write the two-string method. What we're going to do is we're going to do system.out.println. and we're going to do reservation ID dot ID. Let's actually write the toString method here. Public string to. I'm going a little fast because we're a little behind, but this should just be a review, right? So return. We're going to do reservation ID, and that would be just that ID. We need flight number, just flight, and then we need passenger name, this passenger dot. Simple enough. You have the flight number, passenger name, and reservation ID. And here we don't need ID. We can just put the reservation. And we have reservation ID of 1, flight number, whatever you set it to here, and we have the name Zach. Passenger class right here. So let's go. So let's create more flight and more reservation for this one passenger. So I'm going to copy this. So when we delete it, we'll be able to delete it. So let's call that LA to San Francisco. Right, let's stick with 2 for right now. I'm going to make another reservation. Reservation 1 equals to Zach. Make reservation, and flight would be LA to San Francisco. Make the new reservation, and I'm going to print that reservation out. We print out the reservation, or should we print out the list? How can you print that list out? How can you print this? So we're going to be making 2 reservations. How can we print those out from this list of reservations? Would it be toString? Yeah, we could have a toString method here, and that would work too. Or we can just run for loop here. So let's actually, for simplicity, way behind right now. Array.toString. You can do that. Let's do arrays, pass in. How do we get access to this right here? This, so we're going to use the shortcut Garrett suggested. We're going to do arrays.toString. How do we get the access to the list? Remember, we have access to the list, right? So we have Zach is the passenger, and then we have reservations is the name of the list. So we can go ahead and get that, and arrays.toString will actually print it out. All right, so first one is null because that's the index 0. First index is, that's the first reservation, and then that's the second one right here, and everything else is just null. So remember, we have a specific size, right? It goes all the way up to index 9, but we can store. So now let's go and cancel the reservation. So we use cancel reservation, and what do we need to pass in? Remember, when we're canceling the reservation, we need to pass in the reservation itself. And the reservation itself would be name of the reservation, whatever you saved it as. I'm going to print the array before and after, so you'll be able to see if it actually cancels this reservation we're trying to cancel. So we're trying to cancel this one, the first one, which is flight 230, and we'll change this one to 850. So a little different. Seattle to LA would be canceled. The reservation itself would be canceled. So the first one is this right here. Flight 230 still exists. Then the second time you print it out, that is canceled. So why did we have to keep track of 2 reservation systems? So we have one for the passenger, one for the flight. So if you're falling behind, you have access to all those 3 files. Should be able to import into IntelliJ and should be good.